The bullet that grazed Jake Morrison's shoulder in a saloon fight outside Cheyenne wasn't what brought him to his knees, but watching a woman with sun-streaked hair approach a wild Mustang in the middle of the Wyoming grasslands, with nothing but her voice and her hands, made him understand he'd never truly seen strength before. Jake had been drifting through Wyoming territory in the summer of 1878, healing from more than just the flesh wound that still pulled tight across his left shoulder. 26 years old and already worn down by too many cattle drives, too many card games, and one woman back in Texas who'd chosen a banker over a drifter with nothing but a horse and a bedroll. He'd come north thinking the change of scenery might settle something restless in his chest, might make him feel like a man with purpose instead of just another cowboy chasing the next dollar. The ranch where he'd found work belonged to Thomas Garrett, a gruff old cattleman who ran a spread about 15 miles outside of Laramie. The pay was decent, the work was hard, and Jake had been content to keep his head down and his mouth shut. He bunked with 5 other ranch hands in a long cabin that smelled of tobacco and sweat, and he spent his days mending fences, breaking horses, and trying not to think too much about where his life was heading. He first heard about Eleanor Garrett from the other ranch hands. She was Thomas's daughter, 23 years old, and she'd been away at a school back east for the past 5 years. The men spoke about her return with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. A woman educated in Boston had no business on a Wyoming cattle ranch, they said. She'd probably last a week before begging her father to send her back to civilization. Jake hadn't paid much attention to the gossip. He'd learned long ago that ranch hands would talk about anything to pass the time, and the boss's daughter was none of his concern. He had his own problems to worry about. Then one morning in late June, he'd been riding the eastern pasture, checking on a section of fence that had been damaged in a storm when he saw her. She was standing in a clearing about 100 yards away, and at first he thought she was in danger. There was a Mustang, a big buckskin stallion with a black mane, circling her with its ears pinned back and its eyes rolling white. The horse was one of the wild ones that came down from the mountains, and Jake had seen what those animals could do when they felt cornered. He'd started to spur his horse forward, his hand already moving toward the rifle in his saddle scabbard, when something made him stop. The woman wasn't running. She wasn't even moving. She was just standing there, her body relaxed, her hands at her sides, talking in a voice too low for him to hear the words, but steady enough that he could hear the rhythm of it carrying across the grass. Jake pulled his horse to a halt and dismounted, watching from behind a stand of cottonwoods. He told himself he was staying in case she needed help, but the truth was, he couldn't look away. The Mustang circled her twice more, snorting and tossing its head. The woman turned slowly, keeping her body angled away from the horse, never making direct eye contact. She kept talking, that steady stream of words, and gradually the Mustang's ears came forward. It stopped circling and stood about 20 feet away, its whole body tense and ready to bolt. The woman took a step backward, then another. The Mustang followed, just one step, its curiosity apparently overcoming its fear. She stopped again and waited. Jake's shoulder ached from the tension of holding himself still, and he realized he'd been holding his breath. This went on for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 20 minutes. The woman would take a step back, wait, and the Mustang would take a step forward. Sometimes the horse would spook and wheel away, and she would just stand there, waiting, talking, until it came back. She never rushed. She never reached out too soon. She just existed in that space with the animal, patient as stone, soft as water. Finally, the Mustang walked right up to her and dropped its head. She raised her hand so slowly that Jake almost couldn't see the movement and touched its nose. The horse shuddered but didn't pull away. She stroked its face, still talking, and the Mustang closed its eyes. Jake felt something crack open in his chest, something he didn't have words for. He'd been breaking horses since he was 14 years old, and he'd always done it the way everyone did it, the way his father had taught him. You roped them, threw them, held them down until they understood you were stronger. You broke their spirit so you could remake it into something useful. He'd never questioned it because that was just how it was done. But watching this woman gentle a wild Mustang with nothing but patience and understanding, he suddenly saw how much strength that took. Real strength, not the kind that came from muscles and violence, but the kind that came from somewhere deeper. The kind of strength it took to be vulnerable in front of something wild and trust that gentleness would win out over force. He knew then, standing in the shade of those cottonwoods with his shoulder aching and his horse cropping grass beside him, that she was stronger than he would ever be. The woman finally stepped back from the Mustang, and the horse wheeled and galloped away, disappearing into the hills. She stood there for a long moment, watching it go, and then she turned and started walking back toward the ranch house. That was when she saw him. She stopped, and even from a distance he could see her stiffen. He felt like he'd been caught doing something wrong, even though he'd just been watching out for her safety. He raised his hand in an awkward wave, and then mounted his horse, riding away before she could ask him what he'd been doing spying on her. His heart was pounding harder than it had any right to, and he couldn't stop thinking about the look of absolute peace on her face when the Mustang had let her touch it. That evening in the bunkhouse, he asked about her as casually as he could manage. "The boss's daughter back yet?" "Got in yesterday," said Pete, one of the older hands. "Saw her at breakfast. Looks just like her mother did, God rest her soul." "She gonna be staying on?" Jake asked, staring at the cards in his hand and trying to sound like he didn't care much about the answer. "That's the plan from what I hear. Old Thomas wants her to learn the business. Figures she'll inherit the place someday." Pete snorted. "Can't see a fine lady from Boston lasting long out here, though. This ain't no finishing school." Jake thought about the way she'd stood in that clearing, utterly fearless, utterly patient. "Maybe she's tougher than you think." "Maybe," Pete said doubtfully. "But I'll believe it when I see it." Jake saw her again 2 days later. Thomas Garrett called all the hands up to the main house after breakfast and introduced his daughter properly. Eleanor Garrett stood on the porch beside her father, wearing a simple blue dress with her hair pulled back in a practical braid. She was tall for a woman, with strong shoulders and calloused hands that Jake noticed when she shook hands with each of the men. When she got to him, her eyes met his and held. They were gray-green, the color of sage, and they were clear and direct. "You're Jake Morrison," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and shook her hand. Her grip was firm. "You were watching me work with the Mustang the other day." Again, not a question. He felt heat rise in his face. "I was. I apologize if that was improper. I saw the horse and thought you might be in danger." Something flickered in her eyes, might have been amusement. "And what did you think once you realized I wasn't?" He could have lied, could have said he'd left right away, but something about those clear eyes made him tell the truth. "I thought I'd never seen anyone gentle a horse like that before. It was remarkable." She studied him for a moment longer, and then she nodded. "Thank you," she said, and moved on to the next man. But Jake felt that nod like a brand, and he knew he was in trouble. Thomas Garrett explained that Eleanor would be working alongside them, learning every aspect of running the ranch. There was some grumbling from the men after she'd gone back inside, muttering about women trying to do men's work, but Jake kept quiet. He had a feeling Eleanor Garrett could handle herself just fine. Over the next few weeks, he learned he was right. Eleanor showed up every morning ready to work, and she didn't ask for any special treatment. She helped with the branding, though Jake could see it bothered her to hurt the animals even for a necessary purpose. She rode out with them to check the herds. She learned to repair tack and mend fences. She wasn't as strong as the men, but she was smart and she learned fast. And she never complained. The other hands gradually came around to accepting her, especially after she proved she could keep up on a long day and wasn't afraid to get dirty. But Jake found himself watching her more than he should, noticing things he had no business noticing. The way she always paused to speak gently to every horse before she saddled it. The way she tilted her face up to the sun when she thought no one was looking. The way she listened when people talked, really listened, like what they were saying mattered. He tried to keep his distance. She was the boss's daughter, and he was just a drifter, and besides, he had already had his heart kicked around by one woman who was too good for him. He didn't need to go down that road again, but fate or chance or whatever you wanted to call it seemed determined to throw them together. They kept ending up paired on tasks, riding out to check the same sections of fence, working together to move cattle from one pasture to another. Thomas seemed to be doing it deliberately, and Jake suspected the old man had noticed that his daughter paid more attention when Jake was explaining something than when the other hands did it. One afternoon in mid-July, Thomas sent them both out to check on a water source in the northern section of the property. It was a natural spring that fed into a small pond, and with the heat of summer, it needed to be monitored to make sure it wasn't drying up. They rode in comfortable silence for the first part of the journey. Jake had discovered that Eleanor wasn't someone who needed to fill every quiet moment with chatter, which he appreciated. But as they rode, he found himself wanting to talk to her, wanting to know more about her. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. She glanced over at him. "Of course. Where did you learn to work with horses like that? The way you gentled that Mustang?" She was quiet for a moment, and he thought maybe he'd overstepped. But then she said, "My mother. She had a gift with animals. She used to say that every creature speaks a language. You just have to be patient enough to learn it. She sounds like a wise woman." "She was." Eleanor's voice was soft. "She died when I was 12, influenza. My father sent me east after that. I think being here without her was too hard for him. And now you're back. And now I'm back." She looked out over the rolling grassland. "I missed this place every day I was gone. Boston was fine and I learned a lot, but it never felt like home. This is home." Jake understood that feeling. He'd left Texas 3 years ago, and he still sometimes woke up missing the particular smell of the air there, the sound of the cattle lowing at dawn. "Why did you stay away so long if you missed it?" "My father needed me to be educated, to learn how to run a business, how to keep accounts, how to deal with bankers and lawyers. The world is changing, and he wanted me to be prepared." She looked at him. "But all the education in the world doesn't mean much if you don't understand the land and the animals. That's what I'm learning now." They reached the spring and dismounted. The water level was lower than it should have been, and they spent an hour clearing debris from the outlet and digging out a channel to improve the flow. It was hot work, and by the time they finished, both of them were sweating and covered in mud. Eleanor sat back on her heels and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt. She was laughing, really laughing, and Jake thought she'd never looked more beautiful. "I don't think they taught this particular skill at finishing school," she said. He grinned. "No, I imagine not." She looked at him, and her smile faded into something more serious. "Can I ask you something now?" "Sure. Why are you here? In Wyoming, I mean. You don't seem like the other hands. You're running from something." It wasn't an accusation, just an observation, but it hit close to home. He looked down at his muddy hands. "Maybe I am, or maybe I'm just looking for something different." "Did you find it?" He met her eyes. "I'm starting to think I might have." The air between them felt charged suddenly, like the moment before a lightning strike. Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment, and he saw her swallow. Then she stood up and brushed off her pants. "We should head back. It'll be dark soon." They rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Jake's mind was racing. He knew he should shut down whatever this was before it went any further, but he didn't want to. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Over the next month, Jake and Eleanor's friendship deepened. They talked while they worked, sharing stories about their lives. She told him about Boston, about feeling like she was always performing a role that didn't quite fit. He told her about growing up in Texas, about his father's ranch that had been lost to debt, about the woman who'd chosen security over love. "She wasn't wrong," he admitted one evening as they walked their horses back to the barn after a long day. "I didn't have anything to offer her. Still don't, really." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think that's all people should care about? What you can offer them?" "I think people need to be practical. Love doesn't pay the bills." "No," she agreed. "But a life without love isn't much of a life either, is it?" He didn't have an answer for that. The Mustang Eleanor had been working with started coming around more regularly. She'd ride out to the clearing where she'd first encountered him, and more often than not, the buckskin stallion would appear. Jake sometimes rode with her, keeping his distance and watching as she continued the slow process of earning the horse's trust. "What are you going to do with him?" Jake asked one day as they watched the Mustang graze about 50 yards away. "When he's fully gentled, I mean." "Nothing," Eleanor said. "I'm not trying to break him or own him. I just want him to trust that not all humans will hurt him." "But all that work, and you won't even keep him?" She shook her head. "He's wild. He should stay wild. I just want him to know that being wild doesn't mean he has to be afraid all the time." Jake thought about that a lot in the days that followed, about how Eleanor approached everything with that same philosophy, trying to understand rather than dominate, trying to build trust rather than demand obedience. It was so different from how he'd been taught to move through the world, and it made him question a lot of things he'd always taken for granted. He was also becoming increasingly aware that he was falling in love with her. He tried to fight it, tried to remind himself of all the reasons it was a bad idea. But every day spent in her company just made it worse. The way she threw herself into her work with complete commitment. The way she treated everyone on the ranch with respect, from her father to the lowest stable hand. The way her whole face lit up when she laughed. The way she looked at him sometimes, like she could see past all his defenses to something better underneath. He knew she felt something too. He could see it in the way she sought out his company. The way her hand would linger when she passed him something. The way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. But neither of them acted on it. She was the boss's daughter, and he was just a hired hand. There were lines you didn't cross. In mid-August, a group of horse traders came through, and Thomas bought a dozen young horses that needed breaking. It was work Jake was good at, and he spent the next week in the round pen working with the new animals. But every time he went to throw a rope, every time he prepared to use force to make a horse submit, he thought about Eleanor and her Mustang. He thought about patience and trust and gentleness. So, he tried something different. With a young bay mare who was terrified of people, he spent hours just standing in the pen with her, talking to her, letting her get used to his presence. He didn't try to catch her or force her to do anything. He just existed in her space, patient and calm, the way Eleanor had taught him. The other hands thought he was crazy, wasting time on an approach that wouldn't work. But after 3 days, the mare walked up to him and let him touch her nose. After a week, he had a saddle on her. After 2 weeks, she was carrying a rider with no fight at all. Thomas noticed. He came out to the pen one evening and watched Jake work with the mare. "That's a different approach," he said. "Yes, sir." Jake ran his hand down the mare's neck. "Learned it from your daughter." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "She's always had a gift with animals. Gets it from her mother." He paused. "She's got good instincts about people, too." Jake wasn't sure what to say to that, so he said nothing. "You're a good hand, Morrison. Reliable, honest. And you've been good for Eleanor. She's happy here, happier than I've seen her since before her mother died." Jake's heart was pounding. "She's a remarkable woman, sir." "Yes, she is." Thomas looked at him directly. "She deserves someone who sees that, someone who respects her strength instead of being threatened by it." "Yes, sir, she does." Thomas nodded and walked away, leaving Jake standing in the pen with his heart racing, and the distinct impression that he'd just been given some kind of permission, even if he wasn't entirely sure for what. That evening, Eleanor found him after dinner. "Walk with me?" she asked. They walked away from the buildings, out toward the pastures, where the last light of day was turning everything gold. Jake's mouth was dry, and he couldn't think of anything to say that didn't sound stupid in his head. "My father likes you," Eleanor said. "I like him too. He's a good man to work for." "That's not what I meant." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "Jake, we need to talk about this." "About what?" He knew he was being a coward, making her say it first, but he couldn't seem to help himself. She gave him a look that was half exasperated, half amused. "About whatever this is between us. About the way you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention. About the way I find excuses to work near you. About the fact that I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the day you told me you thought what I did with the Mustang was remarkable." His breath caught. "Eleanor, I know all the reasons why this is complicated," she continued. "You work for my father. You think you don't have anything to offer. You've been hurt before, and you're scared it'll happen again. But Jake, I don't care about any of that. I care about you, and I hope, you care about me too." He stared at her, this strong, beautiful, impossible woman, and something in him just broke open. "Care about you? Eleanor, I'm falling in love with you. I've been fighting it for weeks, but I can't anymore. I think about you every moment I'm awake, when I'm working with the horses. I hear your voice in my head, teaching me patience. When I look at the sky, I wonder if you're looking at it too. You've changed how I see everything." She stepped closer to him, and he could see tears shining in her eyes. "Then stop fighting it. Stop thinking you're not good enough. You're the best man I've ever known, Jake Morrison." He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks. "Are you sure? Once we cross this line, I'm not going to be able to go back." "I don't want to go back," she whispered. "I want to go forward, with you." He kissed her then, soft and careful, like she was something precious. She made a small sound and kissed him back, her arms coming up around his neck. It felt like coming home. It felt like every good thing he'd ever wanted and thought he couldn't have. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said. "I don't have much, but whatever I have, whatever I am, it's yours." "I love you too," she said, "and you have more than you think. You have honor and kindness and the courage to change. That's everything I need." They walked back to the ranch hand in hand, and Jake felt like the luckiest man alive. Thomas saw them come in together and just nodded, a small smile on his weathered face. The other hands figured it out pretty quick, and there was some teasing, but it was good-natured. Jake had earned their respect, and Eleanor had earned it twice over. The weeks that followed were the happiest Jake had ever known. He and Eleanor stole moments together whenever they could, early mornings before the workday started, evenings after dinner, long rides out to check on the herds that turned into excuses to be alone together. They talked about everything, dreams and fears and hopes for the future. "I want to keep working with horses," Eleanor told him one evening, as they sat by the creek watching the sun set. "Really working with them, the way I did with the Mustang, not just breaking them to ride, but understanding them, helping people understand them." "You could do that," Jake said. "You're good enough. You could teach people a better way." "Would you want to do it with me? We could be partners." He looked at her, surprised. "You'd want that?" "Of course I would. Jake, you've learned so much in just these few months. You have a gift for this, and you care about doing it right. We could build something together, something that matters." The idea took root in his mind, growing into a vision of a future he'd never dared to imagine. A real home, important work, a life built with someone he loved. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "I'd like that a lot." In September, Jake rode into Laramie to pick up supplies and send a letter to his brother back in Texas. He hadn't written home in over a year, hadn't wanted to admit that he was still just drifting, but now he had something to say, something good to share. While he was in town, he stopped by the jeweler and looked at rings. He didn't have much money saved, but he had enough for a simple gold band. The jeweler showed him several, but his eye kept coming back to one, with a small blue stone set in it. "That's a sapphire," the jeweler said. "Not a big one, but good quality. Matches the color of the sky out here." Jake bought it, his heart hammering the whole time. He hadn't asked Thomas for permission yet, hadn't even talked to Eleanor about marriage directly, but he knew. He knew this was what he wanted, what they both wanted. When he got back to the ranch, he found Thomas in his office going over the books. The older man looked up and gestured for Jake to come in. "Sir, I need to talk to you about something," Jake said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. Thomas sat back in his chair. "I figured this was coming. Sit down, son." Jake sat, trying to organize his thoughts. "I know I'm just a ranch hand. I don't have land or money or much of anything to my name. But I love your daughter, sir, and she loves me. I want to marry her, if you'll give us your blessing." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying him. Then he said, "What are your plans? For the future, I mean." "We want to work with horses, really work with them, training them proper. Eleanor has a gift for it, and I'm learning. We thought maybe we could start small, build something over time." He met Thomas's eyes. "I'll work hard, sir. I'll do whatever it takes to give her a good life." "I know you will," Thomas said. "I've been watching you, Morrison. I've seen how you've changed since you came here. I've seen how you treat my daughter, how you respect her mind and her abilities. That means more to me than money or land." Jake felt hope flare in his chest. "So, you'll give us your blessing?" "I will, on one condition." Thomas leaned forward. "I've got more land than I can work properly. There's a section to the west, about 500 acres with good grass and water. I'll deed it to Eleanor as a wedding present, and you two can build your horse training operation there. You'll still help out here when we need it, but you'll be building your own place, your own future." Jake couldn't speak for a moment. It was more than he'd ever dreamed of, more than he'd thought possible. "Sir, that's too generous." "It's not generous. It's smart business. You two have skills I don't have, and there's a need for good horse trainers. Plus, it keeps my daughter close by." Thomas smiled. "And it makes an old man happy to see his child found someone worthy of her." Jake stood and offered his hand. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." Thomas shook his hand firmly. "I know you won't. Now go ask her proper, before she comes in here and demands to know what we're talking about." Jake found Eleanor in the barn, checking on a mare who'd thrown a shoe. She looked up when he came in, and something in his face made her straighten up. "What is it? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." He walked over to her and took her hands. Everything's right. Eleanor, I talked to your father. Her eyes widened. And he gave us his blessing. Jake fumbled in his pocket and pulled out the ring. Eleanor Garrett, I don't have much to offer except my love and my commitment to building a life with you. But if you'll have me, I promise I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of you. Will you marry me? She was crying and laughing at the same time, and she pulled him into a kiss before she even answered. When she finally pulled back, she was beaming. Yes. Yes, of course, yes. He slipped the ring on her finger, and it fit perfectly. She held her hand up to look at it, and the blue stone caught the light. It's beautiful. Jake, it's perfect. Your father is giving us land, he said. To the west. We can build our own place, start our horse training operation. She threw her arms around him, and he held her tight, breathing in the smell of hay and horses and her particular scent that he would know anywhere. This was real. This was happening. All the years of drifting, of feeling like he didn't belong anywhere, and he'd finally found home. They were married in late October, right before the first snow. It was a simple ceremony at the small church in Laramie, with the ranch hands and a few folks from town in attendance. Eleanor wore a dress she'd brought from Boston, pale blue silk that matched her ring. Jake wore his best shirt and pants and boots polished until they shone, and he'd never been so nervous in his life. But when Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm and smiled at him, all the nervousness disappeared. There was only her, only this moment, only the future spreading out before them, bright with possibility. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor each other for as long as they lived. When the preacher said Jake could kiss his bride, he did so tenderly, aware of everyone watching, but caring only about the woman in his arms. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with food and music and dancing. Jake wasn't much of a dancer, but he held Eleanor close and moved with her under the stars, and it didn't matter that he kept stepping on her feet because she was laughing and he was happy. Thomas pulled him aside at one point in the evening. My wife would have loved you, he said gruffly. She always said Eleanor would need someone strong enough to let her be strong. You're that man. I'll take care of her, sir. I know you will. But let her take care of you too. That's what marriage is. They spent their first night as husband and wife in the main house, in the room that had been Eleanor's growing up. Jake was nervous again, worried about doing everything right, but Eleanor took his face in her hands and kissed him slow and sweet. It's just us, she said softly. No expectations, no performance, just us, learning each other. And it was everything it should be, tender and a little awkward and perfect. And afterward, Jake held his wife in his arms and thought about how much his life had changed in just 5 months. He'd come to Wyoming broken and lost, and now he was whole and found and building something that mattered with the woman he loved. They spent the winter planning their new home and their business. The land Thomas had given them was beautiful, rolling grassland with a creek running through it and a stand of pine trees on the north side that would serve as a windbreak. They worked with a carpenter from town to design a house. Nothing fancy but solid and practical, with a big kitchen and a bedroom, with windows facing east to catch the morning sun. Jake and some of the other hands started building in early spring of 1879, as soon as the ground thawed enough to dig foundations. It was hard work, but satisfying. Every board he hammered, every stone he set, was going into something permanent, something that would last. This was his home, his and Eleanor's. While the house was being built, they started acquiring horses. Thomas gave them a few from his own herd to start with, including the bay mare Jake had trained. They bought a few more at auction, young horses with good lines that needed gentle handling. And the buckskin Mustang, the one Eleanor had first gentled, started spending more and more time near their new property. He never let himself be penned, but he'd come when Eleanor called, and he'd let her touch him, let Jake approach sometimes too. He's chosen to be near us, Eleanor said one day, watching the Mustang graze near the creek. That's worth more than any amount of training could ever be. By July, the house was finished and they moved in. It was strange and wonderful to have their own space, their own kitchen, their own bed in their own bedroom. Eleanor hung curtains she'd sewn herself, and Jake built furniture in the evenings after the day's work was done. A table and chairs for the kitchen, a chest for their clothes, a rocking chair that Eleanor said they'd need someday when they had children. The thought of children made Jake's heart clench with hope and fear. He wanted them, wanted to build a family with Eleanor, but he worried about being a good father when his own father had been so hard and distant. But Eleanor seemed to have no doubts. "You'll be wonderful," she said when he voiced his fears. "You're patient and kind, and you've learned how to teach without breaking spirit. That's exactly what children need." They started taking in horses to train that summer, and word spread quickly about their methods. Ranchers who'd heard about the way they worked brought difficult horses, horses that had been abused or mishandled. Jake and Eleanor worked with each one patiently, never rushing, always trying to understand what the animal needed. It was slow at first, building their reputation, but gradually they became known as the people to go to if you wanted a horse trained right. They weren't the fastest, but their horses were reliable and calm, with no broken spirit, no fear-driven obedience. Jake found immense satisfaction in the work. Every horse they helped felt like a small victory, like he was making amends for all the years he'd broken horses the hard way, and working side by side with Eleanor every day, learning from her, teaching her what he knew, building something together. It was better than anything he'd imagined. One evening in late August, Eleanor asked him to go for a ride with her. They saddled up and rode out toward the hills, the air cooling as the sun dropped lower. Jake noticed she seemed nervous about something, kept glancing at him, and then looking away. "Everything all right?" he asked. She reined in her horse and turned to face him. "I'm pregnant," she said. "About 3 months along, the doctor thinks." Jake felt like he'd been struck by lightning. "Pregnant," he repeated stupidly. "Is that okay?" Eleanor asked, and he could hear anxiety in her voice. "I know we haven't talked about the timing, and we're still getting the business established, but—" He dismounted quickly and pulled her down from her horse, kissing her hard. When he pulled back, he was grinning so wide his face hurt. "Okay, Eleanor, it's more than okay. It's wonderful. We're going to have a baby." She laughed, relieved and happy. "We're going to have a baby," she repeated, like she was testing out the words. They rode home slowly, talking about all the things they'd need to do, plans they'd need to make. They'd have to add on to the house eventually, build more rooms for children. They'd need to be more careful about which horses they took on. Couldn't risk anything too dangerous while Eleanor was pregnant. "I can still work," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm pregnant, not fragile." "I know that, but we're going to be smart about it. No getting in the pen with the difficult ones, no. Jake Morrison, I am not going to spend the next 6 months sitting in a rocking chair doing needlework." He held up his hands in surrender. "I know, I'm just saying we'll be careful. We'll be smart. This baby is precious and so are you." Her expression softened. "We'll be smart," she agreed. Thomas was thrilled about becoming a grandfather. He started coming around more often, always with some excuse about checking on a horse or bringing supplies, but really just wanting to see how Eleanor was doing. Jake found it endearing, this gruff old cattleman who tried to pretend he wasn't excited about a baby. The winter of 1879 was hard, with more snow than usual, and temperatures that dropped below zero for weeks at a time. Eleanor's pregnancy progressed steadily, her belly growing round under her heavy winter clothes. Jake worried constantly about whether she was warm enough, eating enough, resting enough. She tolerated his fussing with good humor, but she also kept working, refusing to be treated like an invalid. In late February, on a night when the wind howled around the house and snow piled against the walls, Eleanor went into labor. Jake rode through the storm to fetch the doctor from Laramie, his heart in his throat the whole way. The doctor was a stern woman named Margaret Chen, who'd come west from San Francisco and had delivered half the babies in the territory. She took one look at Jake's panicked face and told him to calm down. "First babies take their time," she said. "Go get Thomas if it makes you feel useful, and then stay out of my way." The labor lasted 14 hours. Jake spent most of it pacing the kitchen, while Thomas and Dr. Chen took care of Eleanor. He could hear her occasionally, the sounds of pain that made him want to break down the door and fix everything, but Thomas kept him firmly in the kitchen. "She's strong," Thomas said. "She can do this." Finally, as dawn was breaking and the storm was clearing, Jake heard a baby's cry. He was on his feet instantly, and Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway, smiling. "You have a son," she said. "Big, healthy boy. And your wife did beautifully." Jake pushed past her into the bedroom. Eleanor was propped up against the pillows, exhausted and sweaty and radiant, holding a bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up when he came in, and her smile was like the sun coming up. "Come meet your son," she said. He crossed to the bed and looked down at the tiny red face peeking out of the blankets. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and his eyes were squinted shut, and Jake had never seen anything more perfect in his life. "He's beautiful," Jake whispered. "He's got your nose," Eleanor said, laughing a little. "Poor kid." Jake sat carefully on the edge of the bed and reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand. The small fingers curled around his, and he felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Hi there, little one. I'm your daddy." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. "We did it. We made a person." "You did it. You're incredible." He kissed her forehead, her hair, anywhere he could reach. "I love you so much." They named the baby Samuel, after Jake's grandfather, who'd been the only gentle person in his childhood. Samuel Thomas Morrison. Thomas wept when they told him, which he tried to hide by coughing and claiming the smoke from the stove was bothering him. The first few months were exhausting and wonderful. Sam was a good baby, healthy and growing fast, but he kept them up at night and demanded constant attention during the day. Jake and Eleanor learned to function on little sleep, passing the baby back and forth, taking turns so the other could rest. The horse training had to slow down for a while, but their clients were understanding. Jake discovered he loved being a father. He loved holding Sam, walking him around the house when he was fussy, singing to him in a low voice. He loved watching Eleanor with their son, the fierce protective love in her eyes, the gentle way she handled him. Their family felt complete in a way he hadn't known he was missing. As Sam grew from an infant to a baby who could sit up and then crawl, Jake and Eleanor gradually got back to their work with the horses. Eleanor wore Sam in a sling sometimes while she worked, and Jake built a safe pen near the barn where they could put him when he got older, where he could watch them train while staying out of danger. The business continued to grow. They were making enough money to be comfortable, and their reputation spread beyond just the local area. People came from as far as Montana and Colorado to have them train horses. They hired a young man named Charlie to help with the day-to-day work, and he proved to be a quick learner with a natural gentleness that reminded Jake of Eleanor. Life fell into a rhythm that felt right. The work was hard but satisfying. Their home was filled with love and laughter. Sam grew into a bright, curious toddler who loved the horses and showed early signs of his mother's gift with animals. In the summer of 1882, when Sam was 2 years old, Eleanor announced she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, probably because they knew what to expect. Their second child, a daughter they named Rose, arrived on a clear October morning with much less drama than her brother's birth. She came into the world screaming her displeasure at the cold air, and she kept that fierce spirit as she grew. With 2 children, the house felt full and chaotic and perfect. Sam adored his little sister, wanting to help with everything, even though he was still so small himself. Jake and Eleanor moved through their days in a constant dance of feeding children and training horses and stealing moments alone when they could. Years passed in a blur of ordinary miracles. The children grew. The business thrived. The house got additions built on, more bedrooms, a bigger kitchen. The Mustang, the buckskin who'd started everything, stayed nearby, never quite tamed but always around, like a guardian spirit watching over their land. Jake sometimes thought about the man he'd been when he first came to Wyoming, lost and broken, and convinced he had nothing to offer the world. That man seemed like a stranger now. He'd learned so much from Eleanor, about patience and gentleness and real strength, about how being vulnerable wasn't weakness but courage, about how the best things in life came not from force but from trust. One evening when Sam was 6 and Rose was 4, Jake and Eleanor sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard. The sun was setting, painting everything gold and rose, and Jake reached over to take his wife's hand. "Do you ever think about how lucky we are?" he asked. Eleanor smiled. "Every single day, though I don't think it's just luck. I think we built this, together." "You built me," he said. "I was nothing when I came here." She turned to look at him, serious now. "That's not true. You had everything you needed inside you already. I just helped you see it. Do you remember the first time I saw you? With the Mustang? I remember you watching from the trees, thinking you were being subtle." She laughed. "I remember being annoyed at first, and then intrigued. This cowboy who looked at a wild horse with wonder instead of just seeing something to break. I watched you gentle that horse with nothing but patience, and I knew right then you were stronger than I would ever be. Strength isn't about force, Jake. You taught our children that. You teach every horse that comes through here. You've probably taught half the ranchers in Wyoming by now." He thought about that, about all the horses they had trained over the years, all the people who'd watched their methods and started applying them with their own animals. Small changes, spreading outward like ripples in water. Maybe they were making more of a difference than he'd realized. Sam came running up to the porch then, breathless and excited. "Papa, the Mustang is back. He's down by the creek with 2 other horses." Jake and Eleanor stood up and walked down with the children to see. Sure enough, the buckskin was there with a mare and a young colt. The Mustang watched them approach but didn't bolt, comfortable enough with their presence after all these years. "He has a family now," Rose said, delighted. "He does," Eleanor agreed. "Just like we do." They stood there together, the 4 of them, watching the wild horses in the fading light. Jake put his arm around Eleanor's shoulders and felt the solid warmth of his children pressed against his legs. This moment, right here, was everything he'd never dared to hope for. The years continued to unfold with their share of both challenges and joys. There were hard winters and dry summers, horses that tested their patience and skills, the inevitable struggles of raising children and running a business. But through it all, Jake and Eleanor remained partners in every sense of the word, facing everything together. In 1885, Eleanor started teaching other people her methods more formally, holding workshops on their ranch for anyone who wanted to learn. Women came especially, drawn by the idea of a woman who was respected for her skills with horses, who'd built a successful business on her own terms. Eleanor taught them everything she knew, generous with her knowledge and time. Jake found himself teaching too, working with young cowboys who wanted to learn a better way. He remembered being that young man who thought strength meant domination, and he tried to give these boys what Eleanor had given him, a different vision of what it meant to be strong. Their children grew up surrounded by horses and love and the wide Wyoming sky. Sam inherited his mother's intuitive understanding of animals, while Rose was more analytical, always wanting to know the why of things. Both of them could ride before they could properly run, and both of them absorbed their parents' philosophy about treating animals with respect and patience. Thomas lived to see his grandchildren grow into confident, capable young people. He died peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1890, and they buried him next to his wife on a hill overlooking the ranch he'd built. Sam was 10 and Rose was 8, and they both understood that their grandfather had been a good man who'd loved them fiercely. Jake stood at the grave with his arm around Eleanor, watching her say goodbye to her father, and he wished he could take away her pain. But he'd learned by now that you couldn't protect people from grief. You could only be present for it. So he held her while she cried, and he was there when she needed him, and he let her be strong in her sadness. Thomas left the main ranch to Eleanor, and she and Jake had to figure out how to manage both properties. They ended up hiring a foreman to run the cattle operation, while they focused on their horse training, but it was a lot of work and responsibility. Still, they rose to meet it, the way they'd always risen to meet challenges, together. In 1892, when Sam was 12 and Rose was 10, a man came to their ranch with a proposition. He was from back east Philadelphia, and he'd heard about their training methods. He wanted to write a book about them, their approach to working with horses. It would include photographs and detailed descriptions of their techniques, and it would be distributed to horse trainers and ranchers across the country. Eleanor and Jake discussed it at length. They were private people, not accustomed to attention beyond their local area. But they also saw the potential to spread their philosophy even further, to help people and horses they'd never meet. They agreed, and the man, a writer named Edward Phillips, spent 3 months on their ranch observing and documenting everything they did. The book was published in 1893, and it changed their lives. Suddenly, they were receiving letters from all over the country, from people who'd read the book and wanted to learn more. Some people even made the journey to Wyoming specifically to study with them. They adapted to this new reality, hosting students for weeks or months at a time, teaching them not just techniques, but a whole philosophy about working with animals. Their ranch became something of a school, and both Eleanor and Jake found deep satisfaction in passing on what they'd learned. Through all of this, their marriage remained the bedrock of everything else. They still stole moments alone when they could, still talked long into the night about their dreams and fears and hopes. They'd learned each other so thoroughly over the years, could communicate with a glance, could sense when the other needed space or comfort or support. Jake never stopped being amazed by his wife. She was in her 40s now, with threads of silver in her hair and lines around her eyes from squinting into the sun, and she was more beautiful to him than ever. She'd built something extraordinary with her life, had changed how countless people thought about working with animals, and she'd done it while raising children and being a partner and still finding time to gentle wild Mustangs just because it brought her joy. And Eleanor still saw in Jake what she'd seen that first day, the man who'd been humble enough to recognize strength in gentleness, brave enough to change his ways, loving enough to build a life around, supporting her dreams as much as his own. He'd become the teacher she'd always known he could be, patient and wise and kind. In the summer of 1897, Sam left for college back east. He was 18 now, tall and confident, and ready to see the world beyond Wyoming. He'd been accepted to an agricultural college where he planned to study animal husbandry and then come back to expand the family business. Rose, at 16, was already taking on more responsibility at the ranch, with a particular gift for working with the most difficult horses. The house felt too quiet with Sam gone, but Jake and Eleanor adjusted. They had always known their children would grow up and leave eventually. That was part of the job of parenting, to raise people capable of making their own way in the world. Rose left 2 years later for a teacher's college in Denver. She wanted to learn more about education, she said, so she could come back and help develop their teaching program. Both children were building on what their parents had started, taking it in new directions while honoring the foundation they had been given. With the children grown and gone, Jake and Eleanor had the freedom to focus entirely on each other and their work. They took on more students, expanded their facilities, wrote articles for agricultural journals about their methods. They traveled occasionally, going to other ranches to consult on difficult horses or to speak at conferences. But they always came back to Wyoming, to their home with its views of the mountains and the grassland stretching to the horizon. The buckskin Mustang was still around, old now, but still wild, still free. His offspring roamed the hills, a whole herd of them, and they all seemed to recognize Eleanor, would come when she called, even though none of them were tame. In 1902, Sam came home with a wife, a smart young woman named Catherine, who shared his passion for animal welfare. They wanted to build their own place on the property, to start their own family while working alongside Jake and Eleanor. The house got additions built on again, and soon there was the sound of hammering and sawing as a new home took shape. Rose came home too, a year later, with ideas about formalizing their teaching program, creating a real curriculum that could be taught systematically. She'd brought home trunks full of books and papers, her mind full of plans. She was engaged to a fellow teacher, a quiet man named James, who was perfectly content to let Rose's fierce energy shine. Watching their children build their own lives on the land that had given Jake and Eleanor so much felt like completing a circle. Everything they'd built, everything they'd learned, was being passed on and transformed. The ranch was becoming something bigger than just the two of them, a real legacy. Sam and Catherine had their first child in the spring of 1903, a daughter they named Eleanor after her grandmother. Jake held his granddaughter and felt the same fierce protective love he'd felt the first time he held Sam. That sense of miracle at new life. Rose and James married that summer and started building their own house on the property. They had twins the following year, boys who were loud and energetic and kept everyone laughing. The ranch was full of life again, full of children's voices and possibility. Jake was in his 50s now, and the hard physical work was getting more difficult. His shoulder, the old wound from that saloon fight a lifetime ago, ached in cold weather. His hands were stiff in the mornings, gnarled from years of hard work, but he was content in a way he'd never imagined possible. Eleanor had aged too, her hair more silver than gold now, her body not as strong as it once was. But her spirit was unchanged, that same fierce gentleness that had captivated him from the beginning. She still worked with the horses every day, still taught with passion and patience, still looked at the world with wonder. They celebrated their 25th anniversary in the fall of 1904 with all their family gathered around. Sam and Rose had organized the party, and it seemed like half of Wyoming had shown up. There were speeches about the impact Jake and Eleanor had made, about horses and people whose lives had been changed by their methods and their teaching. There was music and dancing and laughter, but the best moment came later, when the crowd had dispersed and it was just Jake and Eleanor walking out to their favorite spot overlooking the creek. The buckskin Mustang was there, ancient now, his muzzle gray and his movements slow. He lifted his head when Eleanor called, and he walked over to them, letting her stroke his face. "He's been with us through all of it," Eleanor said softly. "Our whole life together, he's been here." Jake put his arm around her. "Do you remember what you told me, that first time I asked you what you were going to do with him, once he was gentled? I said he was wild and should stay wild. I said I just wanted him to know he didn't have to be afraid. Do you think we did that? Not just with him, but with all of it. Do you think we made things better?" She leaned into him, and they stood there in the gathering twilight, 3 old souls who'd been through life together. "I think we tried," Eleanor said. "I think we showed people a different way. Some of them listened, and they'll pass it on. It's all any of us can do, really. Plant seeds and hope they grow." The Mustang nuzzled Eleanor's hand once more, then turned and walked away into the darkness. They watched him go, and Jake felt a strange sense of peace, like something was complete. The old horse died that winter, found peacefully in the meadow where Eleanor had first gentled him all those years ago. They buried him there, marking the spot with stones. Eleanor cried, mourning the loss of her old friend, and Jake held her and mourned too, for the animal that had brought them together, that had taught him what real strength looked like. But life went on, the way it always does. The wild herd the Mustang had started was still there, still free. The work continued. More students came to learn. The grandchildren grew. There were good years and hard years, triumphs and sorrows. But through it all, Jake and Eleanor faced everything together. In their 60s and 70s, they gradually passed more responsibility to Sam and Rose, stepping back from the day-to-day operations, but still teaching when they could, still offering wisdom when it was asked for. They'd built something that would outlast them, and there was profound satisfaction in that. Jake would sometimes sit on the porch in the evening, watching the sun set over the land he'd come to love so much, and think about the journey that had brought him here, from a lost cowboy with nothing to his name, to a man with a family and a legacy, all because he'd been smart enough to recognize strength when he saw it, all because Eleanor had been brave enough to show him a different way. They were sitting on that porch one evening in the summer of 1918, both of them in their 60s now, when Eleanor reached over and took his hand. It was something they'd done 10,000 times, but it still made Jake's heart skip. "I was thinking," Eleanor said, "about that day you first saw me with the Mustang. Do you really remember thinking I was stronger than you?" "I do. I remember it exactly. You were standing there, so patient, so fearless, and I realized I'd never had that kind of courage. I'd always used force because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't. But you weren't afraid. You trusted in gentleness, and that takes more strength than I ever had." She smiled. "You found it, though. That strength. You learned it. You taught me. You taught me everything that matters." "We taught each other," she corrected. "That's what we've always done. That's what love is, I think. Teaching each other to be better than we were." They sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, watching the sky turn from blue to gold to pink. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear their grandchildren playing, their laughter carrying on the wind. The horses moved in the pastures, peaceful and content. The land stretched out around them, beautiful and harsh and home. Jake thought about all the years they had had, all the moments big and small that had made up their life together. The struggles and the triumphs, the ordinary days and the extraordinary ones. It had been a good life, better than he'd ever dreamed possible. "I love you," he said, because it was the truest thing he knew, and because even after all these years, he never got tired of saying it. "I love you too," Eleanor said, leaning her head on his shoulder. Then, now, always. They stayed there until the stars came out, 2 people who'd built a life on patience and trust and gentleness, who'd proved that real strength wasn't about domination, but about understanding, who'd shown each other and countless others that there was always a better way, if you were brave enough to look for it. The years continued to pass, each one adding its own layers to their story. By the time they reached their 70s, the ranch had expanded far beyond anything they had originally imagined. What had started as just Jake and Eleanor working with horses had grown into a teaching facility known across the western states and beyond. Students came from as far away as California and Texas, even a few from back east and from overseas, all wanting to learn the Morrison method of horse training, Sam had taken over most of the daily operations, managing the business side with his wife Catherine, while still maintaining the philosophy his parents had established. He'd expanded into breeding as well, developing a line of horses known for their temperament and intelligence. Rose ran the educational program, having written several books of her own about animal behavior and training techniques. Both children had built on their parents' foundation while making it their own, and Jake and Eleanor couldn't have been prouder. The grandchildren were growing up now, young adults with their own dreams and ambitions. Eleanor Rose, named for her grandmother, was 20 and wanted to study veterinary medicine, a new field that was just opening up to women. The twins, Thomas and Jacob, were 18 and working full-time on the ranch, already showing promise as trainers. There were 4 more grandchildren from Sam and Catherine, ranging from 15 down to 8, and all of them had grown up with horses, learning the family philosophy from the time they could walk. Jake's health had started to decline in his mid-70s. His old shoulder injury troubled him constantly, and he'd developed a cough that wouldn't quite go away. The doctor told him his heart was weakening, that he needed to take it easier. Jake tried, but it was hard to sit idle when there was so much still to do, so much he still wanted to teach. Eleanor's joints ached with arthritis, making it difficult to do the physical work she had once done so easily, but her mind was as sharp as ever, and she still spent hours observing horses and students, offering insights and guidance. She'd adjusted her teaching style, doing more talking and demonstrating with words rather than actions, but she was no less effective for it. They'd had a good run, they told each other on the nights when the aches and pains made it hard to sleep. They had lived longer than many people in their generation, had built something meaningful, had loved and been loved. They had no complaints. In the spring of 1923, Jake took a turn for the worse. The cough that had been bothering him developed into pneumonia, and despite the doctor's best efforts, he wasn't getting better. He spent his days in bed, drifting in and out of consciousness, and Eleanor rarely left his side. On a clear April morning, with sunlight streaming through the bedroom window and the sound of horses in the distance, Jake woke to find Eleanor sitting beside him, holding his hand. Her hair was completely white now, her face deeply lined, but her eyes were the same gray-green he'd fallen in love with, clear and direct and full of emotion. "Hi," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Hi yourself." She smiled, but her eyes were wet. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," he admitted. "But okay. Better for seeing you. The kids are here, and the grandchildren. They'd like to see you, if you're up for it." He nodded, and over the next hour, his family came in, one by one, or in small groups. Sam, looking so much like Jake had at that age. Rose with her fierce intelligence and gentle heart. All the grandchildren, some crying, some trying to be brave. He told them he loved them, told them he was proud of them, tried to give them each something to remember. Finally, it was just him and Eleanor again. She climbed into the bed beside him, careful of his frail body, and he turned his head to look at her. "I'm not afraid," he said. "I'm not afraid because I've had everything I ever wanted. This life with you, our family, the work we did, it's been enough. It's been more than enough." Tears were running down her face now. "It hasn't been long enough, though. I wanted more time. We got 50 years, Eleanor. 50 beautiful years. That's more than most people get." I know, but still." She pressed her face against his shoulder, and he could feel her tears soaking through his nightshirt. "I'm not ready to lose you." "You won't lose me. I'll be in every horse we trained, every student we taught, every lesson we passed on. I'll be in our children and grandchildren, and I'll be here." He managed to lift his hand and place it over her heart. "Always here?" They lay there together, holding each other, and Jake felt peace settle over him. He'd lived a good life. He'd loved and been loved. He'd learned what it meant to be truly strong, had learned to be gentle when the world said to be hard. He'd built something that would outlast him. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything. For teaching me, for loving me, for making me better than I was." "You did the same for me," Eleanor said. "We made each other better. That's what we always did." He smiled, thinking about the young woman he'd first seen, gentling a wild Mustang, thinking about how that moment had changed everything. "Do you remember?" he said, his voice fading. "Do you remember the Mustang?" I remember everything. I watched you gentle him with such patience, and I knew then you were stronger than me. The best thing I ever did was recognize that. The best thing I ever did was let you teach me what strength really means." And you learned it, Jake. You learned it, and you taught it to so many others. You did so much good in this world. His eyes were closing now, his breathing shallow. Love you, he managed. Always. Always, she promised, holding him close. I'll love you always. Jake Morrison died peacefully that afternoon, with his wife's arms around him and the sound of horses in the distance. He was 71 years old, and he'd lived a life that mattered. Eleanor buried him on the hill overlooking their land, not far from where they had buried the Mustang and where her parents were laid to rest. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, students and friends, and people whose lives had been touched by Jake's teaching. They spoke about his kindness, his patience, his wisdom. They spoke about how he'd changed their understanding of what it meant to work with animals, what it meant to be strong. Eleanor stood by the grave and listened to it all, grateful that others had seen in Jake what she'd always seen, but also knowing that there were parts of him that belonged only to her. The way he smiled in the mornings, the sound of his laugh, the feeling of his hand in hers. Those things were hers alone, and she would carry them until her own last breath. She lived for 5 more years after Jake's death, and they were both lonely and full. Lonely because she missed him every single day, missed his presence and his voice and his steady partnership. But full because she was surrounded by family, by the legacy they had built together, by the continuing work of teaching people a better way. She still worked with horses when she could, though her body barely allowed it anymore. She still taught, though now it was mostly from a chair on the porch, watching others work and offering insights. She wrote her memoirs, wanting to preserve the story of what she and Jake had built, wanting future generations to understand where it had all started. On quiet evenings, she would walk up to the hill where Jake was buried, and she would sit by his grave and talk to him. She told him about the grandchildren's accomplishments, about new students who were doing well, about small victories and funny moments. She told him she missed him. She told him she loved him. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right and she heard horses in the distance, she could almost feel him there beside her. Eleanor Morrison died peacefully in her sleep in the summer of 1928, at the age of 73. She was buried next to Jake on the hill, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names and the dates of their lives, and a single line: "They taught us what strength really means." The ranch continued after they were gone, run by their children and then their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The Morrison method of horse training spread across the country and eventually around the world, influencing how people worked with animals for generations. Books were written about their techniques, colleges taught their philosophy, and their names became synonymous with patient, gentle, effective animal training. But more than the techniques or the business success, what Jake and Eleanor left behind was a different way of seeing strength. They'd proven that gentleness wasn't weakness, but courage, that patience was more powerful than force, that understanding could accomplish what domination never could. They'd shown that real strength came from being vulnerable enough to learn, humble enough to change, and brave enough to build a life on principles that the rest of the world might not understand. Their love story became part of the ranch's mythology, passed down through the generations. The story of the cowboy who'd watched a woman gentle a wild Mustang and knew in that moment she was stronger than him, and who'd spent the rest of his life learning what that strength really meant. The story of the woman who'd seen potential in a lost drifter and had helped him become the man he was meant to be. The story of 2 people who'd found each other at exactly the right moment and had built something beautiful together. Years later, long after both of them were gone, students would still come to the ranch and ask to hear the stories. They'd walk up to the hill where Jake and Eleanor were buried, where wildflowers grew, and the view stretched out for miles, where you could see horses grazing in the distance. And they'd understand, standing there, what Jake had understood that day he first saw Eleanor with the Mustang. That real strength wasn't about force or dominance. It was about patience and understanding, and the courage to be gentle in a harsh world. It was about recognizing that there was always a better way, if you were willing to look for it. It was about building something that lasted not because you forced it to, but because you nurtured it with love and care and respect. The wild horses still roamed the hills around the ranch, descendants of that first buckskin Mustang. They were free, the way Eleanor had always wanted, but they weren't afraid. They knew that not all humans would hurt them. They'd learned through generations that gentleness existed in the world, And maybe that was the real legacy Jake and Eleanor had left. Not just the ranch or the training methods or even the family they had raised, but the simple truth that love and patience and gentleness could change the world. One person, one horse, one moment at a time. That strength wasn't about being the biggest or the loudest or the most forceful, but about being brave enough to be kind, wise enough to be patient, and strong enough to be gentle. It was a lesson that started with a cowboy watching a woman gentle a wild Mustang, with nothing but her voice and her hands and her infinite patience. A lesson that grew into a love story, into a family, into a legacy that would outlast them both. A lesson that proved in the end that the strongest things in life are built not with force but with love.